Thanks, Jamie. Let me just quickly say something as CIS director, and that is, Jamie probably already mentioned this, but I knew it would advance the slides if I put the paper on it. That we ran a big food security series in the spring quarter, and so we have all the talks from that series up on the CIS website, and then also a website made by one of my undergraduate classes on food security and urban agriculture with a special focus on issues in Chicago and on the South Side. So if you'd like to look at that, that would be good. So that was a great introduction that Ray Offenheiser gave us. I want to move in a little more specifically now to talk about the situation in India, which is part of the kind of broad set of trends that he identified, but there are also some specific and I think very important differences. As sort of every place is a little bit different. India, as you may know, was the leader of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War and had quite a protected, closed economy until relatively recently. So it has a bit of a different story than some other places. So the common perception really of food security in India is something like this of hungry children. And this is of course, actually correct. There's a shockingly high incident of nutrition and stunting in India. UNICEF estimates that 40% of all children below the age of 3 in India are too small for their age, and 47% are underweight. According to the International Food Policy Research Institute's Global Hunger Index, India rates 67th out of 81 countries and has more than 200 million food insecure people, the most in the world. So this pattern, though, of course, is all really the more striking in light of India's recent economic growth. And this economic growth, which really emerged from a period of market liberalization starting in the 1990s, led to the growth that we've all heard a lot about of the numerically large, if actually percentage-wise still very small, Indian middle class. The Indian middle class is only about 5% of the population. It's minute, but that's more than 50 million people, so that's quite a significant factor. So this new affluence has in many ways really changed the face of India. And for those of us who are working in India, I've been working in India for almost 30 years now, it's shocking, actually. It's like another country in so many ways. There's a kind of growth of a cosmopolitan consumer culture from almost nothing to really international levels in just 20 years. And this new affluence has changed the face of India's cities, a kind of internationalization, greater purchasing power. But the impact on rural areas where I work has actually been, although less obvious, but not less significant. I mean, rural areas in much of India still look the same as they did 30 years ago. There's no fake Starbucks out in the place where I work, as there are in the cities now. But there are important shifts in agriculture that many people agree constitutes a serious new form of agrarian crisis in the Indian countryside. So food security issues in India, thus, are incredibly complex. They're different for rural versus urban groups. India is still, in spite of rapid urbanization, still primarily a rural country. 72% of the population lives in rural areas, even though it has some of the largest cities in the world also. And also a kind of emerging problem that we know very well from the United States, and that is of both hungry and overfed people. So now what we see in India specifically is both hunger and obesity side by side. This is still quite a bit less than the US. Here are statistics on overweight and obese in India on the left. The United States is the one on the far right. You can see there's a little catching up to do there. But this really stark contrast, hunger alongside excess, stems, I want to say today, from an extreme extension or kind of recent transformation of what's really a very long-standing division of society into rich and poor, something that's about 2,000 years old. Sure, it's the percentage of overweight and obese adults. The circled bars on the left are from India. The men are blue and the women are kind of orange. And so you can see that for overweight adults in India, you've got 4.4, 4.3%, which is different than it used to be, certainly, but I mean, still compared to the United States, where for men, we have 39% of men overweight, for example. right? And then we have China next to, and Mexico in between. Okay, so it's still nothing like China, Mexico, or the United States, but still it's a growing problem, particularly for those who are growing, I suppose. Okay, so this expansion of economic inequality is in part a consequence of the economic liberalization, the opening of Indian markets in the 1990s and following. So for these newly emerging affluent middle and upper classes then, as we've heard before, there's been a kind of surge of consumerism. A new taste for restaurants, for fast food, for soft drink, increased consumption of meat, and also a massive increase in the number of private cars. So all of these are really new forms of consumption. And thinking about this period from 1990s until now, the period of economic liberalization and beyond, what we see is an interesting situation. That is, on the one hand, there's an expanded role for corporations, but in India in particular, government, both central government, state government, still a very, very important major player. There's not been a massive push to privatize, for example, in India, in spite of international pressure. So this is the case in agriculture, which I'm most interested in here, where industrial farming, the Green Revolution, was aggressively promoted by the government, and in places is particularly supported by it, as we'll see through systems of price supports and direct purchase. But actual inputs in industrial agriculture of things like seeds, pesticides, fertilizers, and so on are supplied by private industry. So we have both public and private players. Farming in India similarly is very, very diverse. From sort of small-scale traditional agriculture to large industrial farms and really everything in between. I'll try and sort of touch on that a little bit today to give you a flavor of it. And as I noted, the current situation for farmers, really of all kinds, all types of farmers in India right now, is actually, in many cases, very dire. Some farmers are making big profits. When food prices go up, you would expect that. But many are struggling with debt, with problems that relate to corruption, and with food insecurity. And ironically, among the most food insecure people in India are often farmers. So until now, official government support for agriculture in India focused on larger farmers with the resources to industrialize production. And this is despite the fact that India's smallholder farmers, that is those who have less than 2 hectares of farmland, that's really very small amount of land. If you don't think in hectares, a hectare is just 100 meters on a side, right? So 100 meters by 100 meters. 78% of India's farmers have less than 2 hectares of land. So most farmers actually have really teeny little plots. So despite owning only about 33% of the total cultivated land, though, these small producers in India actually produce 41% of India's food grains. So they're far from unimportant. And in fact, their productivity of the individual plots, when measured, is actually somewhat higher than that of medium and large-sized farms. So clearly, small farmers are key to India's future food security. But these features notwithstanding, it's smallholder families, together with the families of landless agricultural laborers and the urban poor, who really constitute the bulk of India's hungry and, in some cases, actually starving. So today I want to give a little historical background to the situation. Now, I think I'll be the only historically oriented person here, but that's fun, right? Thinking both about food consumption, how people get access to food, and also about food production, the Indian farmer. So as I said, many farmers today are in significant distress, really in part a consequence of policies that are meant to provide food to a large number of people, especially in cities. So then I'll conclude today by talking about recent efforts to define food security in India, as we heard before, as a basic human right, and particularly a bill that was introduced to Parliament, the Food Security Bill, written in 2011. I put it as one of the resources. It's now in parliamentary committee, and it's not clear exactly where it's going to go. So we'll end with the current debate over the Food Security Bill in India. But before we move back in time, as we will in a minute, I just want to point out that India today actually has aggregate production in excess of needs, that it produces more food than it consumes. India is a food exporter. So clearly, gross productivity is not actually the problem here. And when we, as we'll see, when we look either around the world today, or as I want to talk a little bit about some historically recorded famines, really gross productivity was rarely, if ever, the issue then as well. So it's not as though there's not enough food. That's not really what we're talking about. Okay. So here's a little outline of where we're going today. I want to avoid giving the impression, by talking about famine and crisis all the time, that India is and has always been in crisis, right? Of course, this is not my point, right? Most of the time, things roll along very peacefully and without any major problems. But it's looking at the periods of crisis and the kind of responses to them, and the ways in which both those who suffered and those who were in charge dealt with it, I think is very interesting and a kind of useful way to compare historical periods and think about how we've come to the situation in which we're in now. So this is my outline. Don't worry, I'm going to go very quickly through the earlier periods. To try and see, I think that contemporary concerns in this region are, on the one hand, build from local histories in a very fundamental sense, and the kind of infrastructure of farming and food distribution and so on comes from those, but also in the sense that contemporary people, including politicians and so on, are cognizant of their own history and are particularly sensitive to certain kinds of issues, right? So there's a tendency to sort of have a one-size-fits-all model of thinking about how to deal with agricultural and food security issues across the world. But the point I want to make here is that local differences and local concerns and specific histories really do make a difference. And I think perhaps can help us then to construct strategies that are suited to both the local productive capacities and possibilities. Okay, so we'll go from AD 1000 all the way till today, very, very fast. Okay. All right, so here's a little map of India. So South Asia is a very large area, and it's very difficult to generalize, but agriculturally, there's a kind of fundamental distinction between the millet and rice producing areas of the south and the east, so kind of green and tan on the map here, and the northern parts of India where winter wheat and barley are the primary grain crops. So that's the pink, basically. It says chickpea, wheat, and so on the map, and then there's a desert, so we have a little bit of a problem. So the kind of small pinkish area at the top of the map, in a sense, is the area in which the most kind of official government intervention in agriculture where it has taken place, and those are the areas of winter wheat production. But there's a large area of the country in which agricultural production is organized completely differently. So just the point is here, there's a lot of diversity in different ways of organizing agricultural production. Okay. All right. In all of the country, but especially in the southern part of the country where the rice and millet zone, there's a significant difference between crops that are grown under irrigation and crops that are grown as dry crops. And the premier form of irrigated crop is paddy rice, wet rice production, right, which is incredibly water intensive and requires a complex irrigation infrastructure in most parts of the country, right? The other major form of production that sits side by side really in this same region is a kind of traditional form of dry farming that is often intercropped, small fields of pulses, that is legumes like beans and dal, lentils, that's the word I'm looking for, and small seeded grasses like millets and sorghum. Okay, so the production of pulses, millets, sorghum, and also oil seeds, so like sesame and sort of oil-rich seeds that are used to make oil for cooking, is actually a very important part of the food security story that we're going to talk about. Because up till now, attention has been paid primarily to staple food grains, wheat, rice, maize to some limited extent, but especially wheat and rice, right? But the more nutritious and sort of protein-rich and nutrient-dense but low status kinds of foods like millets, pulses, and oil seeds are a very important sort of problem. Okay. So even in the middle periods, and I keep throwing up little chronological charts here for you so you don't forget what I'm talking about. Even in the middle periods, governments were mostly interested in a limited number of staple crops, especially rice and wheat, and tended to even then ignore hardy and nutritious but low status crops like millets and sorghum. And so we can see actually some of the kinds of precursors to contemporary agrarian distress starting as early as the 16th century. So we always want to blame things on someone, but here we have a long, long history of blame to do, perhaps. Of course, the deep roots of food insecurity in South Asia, as elsewhere, really lie in problems of poverty and unequal access to resources. There's certainly a role for natural disasters, for war, but really these long-term structural issues have been key. And so while the poor, say, have always been with us, or at least since the first millennium AD in South Asia, how exactly inequality and poverty have been structured has changed through time. I think I was supposed to click on this before. Made use of news stories to show that increasingly dal, or lentils, which is a basic part of most Indian diets, especially vegetarian diets, is increasingly imported now, not because India's farmers are not good at growing dal, they're actually very good at it, but because of government policies. Okay. All right, so let's start by thinking a little bit, again, we're still in the contemporary situation. What I want to say is that food security and poverty are not evenly distributed across South Asia, right? There are areas, for example, in a very great series actually written by Ashwin Parulkar, published in the Wall Street Journal, about the food security crisis in India. The parts of northern India in particular, what's sometimes called the Hindi belt, the Hindi-speaking area of the north, have the highest levels of poverty, of inequality, and also of food insecurity. So part of this difference has to do with natural resources and with differences in agricultural production. But much of it also has to do with history. It has to do with history too complex to explain, of land rights and access to land, ownerships, many of which were sort of established and changed in the colonial period, and also, I would say, particularly to the status of women. And the status of women and of low-caste people in particular is generally much, much lower in the north than it is in the south. So Parulkar, in his study, for example, you see the kind of blue-greenish states in the south, Kerala and Tamil Nadu in the far south. These are what he refers to as the best rural districts. So this is the area where child malnutrition on the left is the lowest, underweight and wasting are the lowest, and the orange areas here are the area that he focuses on in his story, in which malnutrition, underweight, and wasting are the highest. It's also worth pointing out, sorry, I don't want to give you too many graphs and figures, but that government spending on health as percent of GDP is actually really quite low in India. So if you see, India is the orange line in this upper left-hand graph. Its government spending is much less than 2% of GDP as compared to the United States, obviously where healthcare is driving a huge part of that. So I'm going to be talking about massive government food assistance programs, and so to give you some sense of how that compares to overall government spending, you should be aware that actually in the kind of big picture terms, it's not really all that much. Okay. I mentioned also this series by Ashwin Parulkar, who's from the Center for Equity Studies in New Delhi. Normally I clip out the ads when I put in these news stories, but I thought you would appreciate the watch ad next to a story. And this story is about failures in existing government food security programs, and about a series of investigations of people who actually have starved to death in India, something the Indian government doesn't necessarily want to admit. So in this series, Parulkar and the Center for Equity Studies in general has done this, documents actual starvation deaths. And what they find is that in every case, They're low caste people, so people of very low social status, people with few occupational and educational opportunities, notwithstanding the fact that there exist all kinds of government programs for access to education, free education, slots in university seats, and so on for low caste people. And particularly in that northern part of the country that you saw in the orange band before. So this is a story about a farmer from, actually a landless laborer from Bihar, which is one of the most poor and least educated states in India. It also has among the highest levels of inequality. And the story is basically, this is my little cautionary tale, I suppose, for talking about the food security bill. The story is a story about corruption, essentially. So in the face of government programs and policies which should have prevented this, he documents people who have starved, who should not have. They didn't have ration cards. They should have had ration cards. There was no maternal and infant health care, despite the existence of programs. There's a school, but there's no teacher in the school. So I think this gives us a kind of powerful reality check in thinking about the existence of policies and programs and how they actually work on the ground, right, and in real life. And particularly the way in which persistent forms of discrimination against particular groups, low caste people and women in particular, continue to be critically important. So let's think about women for a minute. It's important to think that food security can vary even within a single family. I want to try and move away from looking at everything in terms of huge aggregate statistics to thinking about sort of more, I'm an anthropologist, right? Sort of on the ground situation. And within a family, there are major status differences. So here's an ethnographer explaining the situation in which how food is generally distributed within rural households in North India. She writes, food is served in a hierarchical fashion in rural extended families. The eldest males eat first, women and children later. This is still more or less the case, with the lowest in the hierarchy eating last. It's therefore common practice for women, especially the youngest daughters-in-law, who are the lowest in the hierarchy, to feed the entire family first and then to take what may be left over for themselves. And too often there may not be enough. So I know this also even from the South, the rural South where I work. Again, women do the food preparation. It's typically the daughters-in-law who have married into the household who do the cooking and who are the least high-ranking members of the family, even lower ranking than daughters of the household. And there's a hierarchy in the way in which food is served and consumed, boys before girls, men before women, daughters-in-law the very last. So there exists, for example, a whole genre of kinds of stories and poems of sort of daughters-in-law sneaking food in the kitchen, hiding food, and sort of songs and stories of resistance and so on to starvation by their mothers-in-law. So it's a complex situation. All right, let's look back in time a little bit. There have been, during the middle period, remember I told you that's about 1,000 to 1,700 or so, historically recorded famines. So it's not as though problems of monsoon failure and food crisis have been absent historically, right? And what we know about these, and these are difficult to study, and this is actually some of the work that I have done based on both archaeological and historical evidence, is that most of the famines prior to the 18th century or so, while they may have been locally very severe, were generally not very widespread. That is, they seem to be small in scale. And how did people then respond to famine in the past, right? No railroads, no food aid, no rapid communication, nothing like that. Well, there are a series of ways that people do it. One, of course, is through storage. People are still doing this, right? So temples, elites like kings and other people, or just people, farmers and others in their own home would store up food as a kind of buffer against bad years, as a kind of insurance. And in the case of temples and kings, there's a sense of obligation to provide food to the hungry when they need it. Okay. The other important response, which is still critically important to food crisis, is mobility. If there is a failure of crop or food is not available or you don't have access to it, then you simply leave the place and go somewhere else, right? But through time, mobility as an option becomes more and more difficult because, for example, there's less and less available land that people can just go and start farming someplace else where conditions are a bit better, or where kinds of titles to land get more and more formalized. So you can't just, you know, if I can't just go to, say, Iowa because I think conditions will be better and I'm going to start a farm there because there's this crazy thing, well, they want you to buy the land and have a title. You know, I can't just sort of start farming, right? So things get more and more kind of institutionalized through time. And we'll see it's in the colonial period in particular when a lot of these mobility strategies get kind of cut off completely, right? And as title to land gets more difficult. So at all times from, you know, the beginning of agriculture till now, for farmers, there are recurrent themes, sort of persistent issues in dealing with agricultural success and food security. And these are, of course, access to land, access to water, and in South Asia in particular, access to both manure and traction. That is, animal manure for fertilizing fields and animals for plow. So that means basically livestock. So land, water, livestock, and of course labor. Okay. So in the middle periods then we begin to see urbanization and commercialization that introduce markets. And once markets are in place and cities are in place, then the world we recognize very well, non-producers have to suddenly buy food. And that at that moment, then, your food security becomes reliant upon your purchasing power. Okay? But it wasn't always like that. So typically, then, farmers were always the most food secure, especially, oddly enough, small-scale subsistence farmers, because they're growing food, and if they can't sell it, or their price isn't right, or there's a problem, there's a great thing is you can always just eat it, right? So farmers have a kind of safety net built in that urbanites and people without access to agricultural land typically do not. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because the situation now has flipped completely, so that farmers are, in a sense, the most, and landless laborers and others, among the most food insecure. So how has that come to be? Right? That's a process that already started, as I said, in the 16th century. Cities, markets, cash economies is not an invention of the British. It was there for a long time. So problems of access have always been at issue, really, in thinking about food crises. So this problem of access, how people who are not actually growing food get access to food, is what we've already heard about the work of the economist Amartya Sen, who is a Nobel Prize-winning Indian economist, who became very famous for his studies of an early 20th century famine in Bengal. But what Sen referred to was a notion that he called exchange entitlements, right? So I think of this as kind of purchasing power plus, because exchange entitlements is not just how much money you have. That makes a big difference, of course. But we all know that there are other ways that people get access to resources besides having money, even in highly monetized economies. And those are things like your kinds of social relations, your networks, the networks of obligation. So in pre-colonial periods, we have situation in which kings, temples, landlords, for example, had certain kinds of moral obligations to support people. It doesn't mean that they always did what they were supposed to do. And that constitutes a kind of exchange entitlement for someone who's hungry. There are a series of service relationships. So, for example, the village barber who would provide haircuts and so on to everyone in the village, and then in return was entitled to a share of the crop rather than cash. So all kinds of networks of family, of friends, of patronage, and so on that also allow you to have access to resources. And, of course, money, right? So that understanding is still relevant today. I mean, whether it's, the king is replaced by the, government of India, but still the basic relationships are still exist. So it's exchange entitlements then really that determine who eats and who doesn't. So even in these long ago historical cases, it's not generally been, never been perhaps, sheer productivity that's been at the issue. And that's also the case today, of course. There is, in fact, enough food. All right, so let's go on to the colonial period. So it's very clear that the very worst famines in Indian history were those that occurred during the 300 years of British colonial rule. And I'm just going to talk about one of them very briefly. The famine of 1876, which hit a large part of southern India, an area called the Deccan. The official estimates were something like 5 million deaths. Later scholarly reevaluations suggested more like 7.1 million dead, right? That's a big famine. Several things led to the famine. There was a failure of monsoon. There was a low rainfall period. But as I mentioned before, in southern India where rice is a major crop, rice is primarily supported by irrigation. So access to irrigation water, which is not highly dependent on monsoon, actually is part of the story. And of course, a serious problem of poverty and differential exchange entitlements created by inequality. In 1876, even more so than in the 17th century, there were problems created by the existence of food markets. So like other historically recorded famines, like the potato famine we heard about earlier this morning and so on, there was an active export of food right in the middle of the 1876 famine. There was a significant amount of hoarding on the part of merchants and speculators who were hoping the price of grain would continue to go up and they could really make a killing, you might say. No kinds of price controls and so on. Okay. So all of these three factors, the environmental conditions, the existence of poverty, and the operation of markets, were seen by British colonial government as being natural factors, right? So it's natural that some people are rich and some people are poor. It's natural that the rains vary, and that markets have natural operating forces that shouldn't be interfered with. Okay, this is a story I think we know very well now. The famine of 1876 had a disproportionate impact on the landless and the poor, right? People who were wage earners, who did not have farms, people who are pastoralists or urban dwellers. But even here we see, I've given you a couple of illustrations, some historic photographs. This is a drawing from the Illustrated London News in 1876 entitled "Natives Obtaining Food from the Bunyan's Shop in a Bazaar." The Bunya is the merchant, the moneylender. And if you notice in the picture, he's right there in the middle. He's got more clothing on than everyone else. He's looking rather plump and well-fed. Right? So even here, the idea of sort of hunger and abundance, obesity and hunger side by side maybe is not as novel as it seems right at the beginning. I should also point out that not a single British officer died of hunger during the 1876 famine either. So obviously it wasn't something that hit everyone evenly. Okay, so what were the kinds of government responses, official government and responses by the people affected to the 1876 famine? One response on the part of people affected was the same as in pre-colonial famines, and the same as what people do in times of trouble today. That's why we have refugee camps, is mobility. People just moved, right? And in fact, the British government saw the existence of a large number of people roaming around the countryside, as they said, to be the true measure of famine. We know there's really a famine if people leave their homes, leave their fields, and move on, hoping for some kind of food. There was also an effort on the part of a lot of people to move to the princely states, which were not ruled by the British at the time. So that's one of our traditional responses to famine. One of the other ones is sort of both stored resources, and charity. This is still the case, right, in 21st century India. But it was a very late start. The British were very reluctant to pass out food and felt that it was wrong. There was an attachment to a kind of laissez-faire economic organization, kind of free market ideology that argued that it would be interfering with the natural laws, both of demography and of the market. And so very, very late, actually, the British government set up first public works projects, or make-work projects, in which people had to earn food instead of passing it out. Can't let those lazy people get food. But many people were already at that point too weak and not able to do the work, or not able to actually even consume the food, and continued to die. The government did finally set up kitchens. You can see a picture of one At the top, a feeding camp, but really it was too little, too late. There was no change in supply. A lot of, as I said, food was still being shipped out on the newly constructed railroads to places that had even higher prices than this famine-hit area, but that's the natural operation of the market, so you can't do anything about that, right? So in the 1876 famine, subsistence farmers, that is people who grow food, also suffered, but they were slightly better off than wage earners, people who just had money, because they had some of their own stored grain, and also because they could eat their own meager crop. So despite the fact that their crop was worth a lot of money, they could never have purchased it, but they were able to at least consume it. Yet, as I said before, now it's the case that small farmers, dry farmers, are among the most food insecure in India. And I think this is a fundamental shift created in part by changes in agricultural technology, right? So now, more and more kinds of farm inputs are commodities. Things like seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, fuel, tractors. None of that stuff had to be purchased in traditional farming systems. It's not as though there weren't, of course there were inputs and there were costs, and indebtedness of farmers has always been a problem. But now farmers are as linked to markets as everyone else because of changes in the way in which agriculture has been organized. So there may be then some possible insights from historical studies of famines to the problems of contemporary food insecurity. To see that for a long, long time, first of all, food systems has been very complex, right? They include natural factors like soil and rainfall, but these are critically mediated by agricultural and environmental practices, as well as by things like poverty and purchasing power. Also, things like social networks, like gender, age, caste, so on, are also important then and are still important now. And then finally, all of these kinds of complex factors are influenced by government policy, whether these are traditions of charitable feeding from temple storehouses or the idea that markets must be allowed to operate unimpeded regardless of human consequences. Whatever, that makes an impact. Two, this sort of short incursion into history, we're finished now, we're going to the present now, has, I think, an important impact on thinking about agriculture and food in India specifically, right? After independence. Indian independence was achieved in 1947, just after World War II. And so it's not just that historical parallels are sort of interesting and maybe useful, but I think it's also the case that policies and the consciousness of Indian political leaders and Indian people is well aware of this history, right? And this history and people's reactions to it have clearly influenced government policy. Okay. So if we look at the period now post-independence, after 1947, again, a complicated period, but what we see briefly in this period in the 1950s and 1960s is a tremendous enthusiasm on the part of newly independent India for technology, for science, and for industrialism. This is something that was happening in a lot of parts of the world. Of course, here you can see the first Prime Minister of independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru, addressing the audience at the opening of the Bakra Nangal Dam, a huge, huge dam project that was constructed in the 40s and 50s. Nehru felt that industrialization was really the key to prosperity and the way to make India no longer be poor. Agriculture in this period in the late 40s, 50s, early 60s got much less support, no support really, compared to heavy industry. And there was a push to industrialize. And by the late 1960s, agriculture was pulled into this industrialization push through the adoption of the Green Revolution model. So it was especially the historical memory of famine and the humiliation and embarrassment that Indian government leaders felt by having to import food, especially from the United States, that they were not on very friendly terms with, through the 1950s and 60s, a period in which massive amounts of US grain were shipped to India under Public Law 480, a period that was sometimes called ship to lip. So food comes in, the ships immediately consumed. That was a period of great embarrassment and humiliation for leaders of a newly independent country who wanted to be self-sufficient. So they adopted Green Revolution models, and in 1966, 1967, the first high-yielding varieties were introduced. And the area in which this took place was primarily, although not exclusively, in the northwest. You remember that kind of, I think it was pink, the wheat growing area way up in the north and western parts of the country, and particularly in the state of the Punjab. So the Punjab became a kind of poster child for the success of the Green Revolution, and the Green Revolution was very much dominated by industrialized production of wheat in this area. But remember, there's a whole other part of the country in which wheat is not part of the picture, right? So following decolonization, there was some land reform. There had been concentration of a lot of land in a few hands under large landlords. There was, I think, a failed opportunity to redistribute land more broadly to farmers. There was some a weak bill of land ceilings, which are widely flouted. So rather than large-scale land reform. So some of the forms of rural inequality that we see from the days of the British continued with powerful landlords who have many tenants and lots of landless laborers. And it's a situation which has been improving, but not probably fast enough, right? So as I said, there are many small farmers in India, but the kind of idealistic hope of certain independence agrarian reformers, people like Gandhi, who had imagined a kind of rural utopia of small farms in independent India, never really came to fruition. Instead, it was the kind of industrial imagination of people like Nehru. Okay, so we're on to the Green Revolution now. So the Green Revolution, as I said, has been wheat-focused, and it particularly benefited large farmers. It's highly capital intensive. You know, the Green Revolution, I'm sure you know, is a kind of industrial model of agricultural production involving all sorts of purchased inputs that become commodity. And one thing that's worth pointing out is that there's a massive reliance on irrigation associated with Green Revolution technology, right? The high-yielding varieties are designed to grow under certain kinds of conditions, and those conditions involve a lot of water. So in the Punjab, in particular, the conditions were right because of a massive investment on the part of the British in constructing canals, irrigation canals across the Punjab, right, which made all that possible. But irrigation infrastructure is by no means evenly distributed across South Asia. And of course, rainfall, for example, is radically divergent in different areas as well. So this was part of the push for the big dam projects, the construction of gigantic dams, like you saw Nehru there at the inauguration of the Bakra Nangal Dam. And those of you who follow anything about the politics of big dams or of India know that there's tremendous controversy in India now about the construction of hundreds, thousands actually, of large dams across the river Narmada and other places that people are really protesting, right? So the United States is mostly taking down dams. We don't really build big dams anymore. India and China, on the other hand, are building dams at a rapid pace. Okay. The problem is that a lot of these dams, there are many problems, but one of the problems with these big dam projects in India is that they were designed, a lot of them were built during the colonial period and just finished after independence, to be what are called protective works rather than productive works. That sounds a little weird, but what they were meant to be was to protect the land, to protect people against famine. So here's this anxiety about famine that informs a great deal of policy, right? So the idea was that we're going to dam a river, and we'll have canals and things, and then the water will be parceled out in small amounts to a lot of different farmers, so that small-scale farmers, people producing millets and dal and beans and things, can have a more secure crop. The idea wasn't that there would be heavy growing of water-intensive crops like rice and especially sugar cane at the head end of the canal where there's a lot of water by rich farmers, and no water at the tail end of the canal by poor people with little political clout. Because of course, actually, that's what happened, right? So all of these works, these big dam projects that were classified as protective works, which were meant to parcel water out evenly across a lot of people to sort of make production more secure, not necessarily to change the kinds of crops people could grow, were subverted, really. And so people with the wealth and power and influence took the water. They were right at the head of the system. They're growing highly productive and intensive forms of crops, especially commercial crops like sugar cane, in some cases cotton, and also rice. Okay. So the Green Revolution then overall did certainly, and I'll show you a graph in a minute, increase production nationwide. But what we see now is that these gains are actually slowly being lost, that that environmental degradation has been a significant factor, and a lot of the productivity gains of the Green Revolution are being reversed, even if we forget about the fact that it's massively subsidized by fossil fuels. Small farmers, though, in general, did not share the gains of the Green Revolution, especially dry farmers, those ones growing millets and pulses and other kinds of things, and who didn't have access to irrigation. So what we see then is the emergence of a kind of, let's say, third, or there are more than two, but say the third form of agricultural production following the Green Revolution. So people sort of doing, let's just call it the traditional thing, right? In my area, people are still plowing with bullocks. It's all organic farming because no one uses pesticides or fertilizers or anything. They've been doing it the way they've been doing it, more or less. And then there is industrial, large-scale production. Here's a Punjabi farmer on his tractor in his wheat field in a way that was not really look out of place, particularly right here in Illinois, right? But a third form emerged, and that's a kind of a new form, a kind of a quasi-Green Revolution form in which farming is done using industrial inputs, but without the support of water, without the support of irrigation. And the classic case here are cotton farmers, especially in the dry parts of southwestern and central India. So cotton farmers, dry cotton farmers, use hybrid seeds, sometimes GMO seeds. They use commercial pesticides and fertilizers, but tend to have a very poor access to credit, so they tend to be deeply in debt. So if you buy stuff, you have to have money, right? Sort of rule. I'm not an economist, but even I know that. If you buy things, you have to have money. You have to have money up front, also, for farmers at the beginning of the season. And so what that means is borrowing money. But it's a very poor banking infrastructure, so remember that Banya, that nice plump fellow in 1876? Yeah, they're still there, right? So it's from rural moneylenders in particular that people take loans. So the production of commercial crops, though, especially cotton and other things also, is very risky. It's risky agriculturally because sometimes the rains fail and so your cotton crop doesn't produce. There was a terrible celebrated case recently in Andhra Pradesh where a particular batch of GMO cotton bloomed, but it failed to produce cotton. Or any other kind of problem, because, and also because of price volatility, right? So cotton has sometimes been called a suicide crop, actually, because of the extreme price volatility. And when you have sort of low rate of return and deep rate of debt, there's a problem. So this debt crisis plus price volatility has led to, as I'll talk about in a minute, a huge rash of farmer suicides across India. Thousands. Some people say 200,000 farmers since 1997 have committed suicide. This is a talk in itself. I don't have time to say everything about it, but I should note that the locations of farmer suicides up till now have traditionally been in the parts of the country, those dry farming areas where people are growing hardy grains, millets, and oil seeds, right? So those are not part of government price supports or food distribution systems, right? So remember the news story, India's dal is no longer from India, right? The government food systems that I'll talk about are all about staple grains. They're not about millets, they're not about lentils and so on. And so it's those farmers who have turned to these sort of more risky forms of sort of quasi-industrial farming like cotton. And of course, trying to get a better life and make a better future. So there was, as I said, this rash of farmer suicides. It's not over. I mean, it's still going on. Every 12 hours, one farmer commits suicide in India. And this is in the part of the country where I work, and I know very well, where marginal kind of dry farmers in the south, in the west, and in central India. But recently, the spate of farmer suicides, highly indebted farm families faced with some kind of crisis, and the only way out is seen to be suicide. There's some government payment once you get a suicide. Recently, however, there have been extension of this pattern of farmer suicide to the Punjab. Remember the Punjab, it's that area in the north, that wheat-growing area, the poster child of the Green Revolution. It's the model of Indian agricultural success, right? Of the marvels of high-yielding varieties and so on. But even in these areas, there have been serious problems, and there are increasingly suicides. So some of the kinds of problems that are being experienced now in the industrial agricultural areas in the north and west are falling productivity of crops due to soil depletion, due to waterlogging and salinization. That's a consequence of improperly applied irrigation water. Insect resistance to pesticides. This is what people sometimes refer to as the pesticide treadmill. So it's great to be in business as a pesticide producers because insects are really good at getting resistance to pesticides. And so then you have to keep changing your pesticides. Oh, 1 minute. Okay. And then also tremendous levels of debt, right? So falling water tables, massive investments in new irrigation facilities. Oh, crap, 1 minute. Okay, so despite the significant growth in the use of agricultural fertilizer in India, here's one of these giant bubbles where people have been pumping industrial fertilizers on their field at a great rate. In spite of that, wheat yields have absolutely plateaued. Okay. So in the 1 minute I have left, crap. I'll tell you a little bit about public distribution systems, right? So the Indian government has in place actually quite marvelous, if mostly oftentimes ineffective, systems to reduce poverty and enhance food security, partly based on this kind of post-independence impulse of betterment and self-sufficiency, right? A big part of that is direct purchases of food grains from farmers and distribution to consumers through what are called fair price shops in the public distribution system, right? So it's not food stamps in the sense that you get a card or something. They're literally shops with government purchased grain as part of the PDS. There are 500,000, there are 500,000 fair price shops across India. It's a vast, vast system of distribution. And people with ration cards are entitled to purchase a certain quantity of highly discounted rice, wheat, sugar, and kerosene. And right now, only people who are below the poverty line are eligible. There are some problems, though, with the PDS, public distribution system. First of all, the quality of grain in these is often very poor storage conditions, massive corruption, selling the good stuff, distributing the bad stuff. There are no pulses or edible oils, it's only grain. There's not enough in many cases, and of course the biggest problem is rampant corruption. So there are many people who are entitled to ration cards who don't get them because the government official who's supposed to give you your ration card wants a bribe before he'll give you your card, so you're not going to get it. And a 2008 Planning Commission report in India suggested that only about 42% of subsidized grains actually reach the beneficiary, right? On the other hand, so the public distribution system is noble and amazing, but also a mess. There's no more famine, though. And this is not a matter of increased productivity, as we know. But there is, in fact, better and more consistent access to food based on a national consensus that this is the right thing to do, right? So we have a clunky, a corrupt, and a problematic public distribution system, but there's no doubt that it has saved many people from extreme hunger. Okay, so we'll just end here on the food security bill. I'll go over 1 minute, sorry, Jamie, to tell you about this. So we've had both a kind of success and failure, and the food security bill is an effort. It's being promoted by the Congress Party, which is in power right now, although rather a little bit at risk. It was proposed in 2011. It's one thing I posted you should really look at. It's quite an amazing document. It's in committee right now, and it stems in part from a series of public litigation cases that we don't need to think about. But the goal of the National Food Security Bill is to enable assured economic and social access to adequate food for all persons in the country at all times. And you don't need to read this, but the point I want to make from this highly edited preamble to the Food Security Bill is it's based on the idea of food as a basic and fundamental human right. And it lays out in great detail where this right comes from, both in terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also in terms of the kinds of rules of the Indian Constitution itself, right? So the Food Security Bill aims to cover some 75% of rural households and 50% of urban households. And if it passes, which it may not, what it will represent, in effect, is a massive expansion of the public distribution system. Many, many more people, not only those who are now classified as BPL, below the poverty line, will be entitled to food at highly subsidized rates, food that will be directly purchased by the federal and state governments, right? So now it's only people who are below the poverty line who have access to fair price shops. Under the new system, there will be households will be classified as priority, general, and excluded. So priority groups will get, for example, 7 kilos of food grains per month at 3 rupees a kilo for wheat and so on. The general group will get 3 kilos a month subsidized, and the excluded group, the rich people, won't get nothing. Right? It's going to cost about $3.75 billion more than the government's paying now, which has been a great cause for concern, particularly as India's economy is slowing down a bit. But really, this is such a small percentage of the GDP that's, perhaps not the main issue. What is very important is that the public distribution system as it stands, it's huge, it's complicated, it employs I don't know, how many people does it employ? It employs something like 1 million people, right? So it's a major job producer. But it's also so corrupt, right? So the fact that it's so problematic and so corrupt, yet it's in place and it sort of kind of works sometimes, is not a trivial concern. The new Food Security Bill importantly defines women as heads of households, a major change, right? And it aims to have fair price shops wherever possible run by women's committees. It sets a goal to eventually include non-grain items like edible oils and pulses, which are obviously nutritionally very important and also important for farmers who produce those. So I won't go through this because I'm out of time. But when thinking about this talk, I thought, okay, I'm going to make a list of like how we can fix the situation, right? I'm not a policy person, I'm an academic. So I was like, normally people don't ask me to fix things. They just ask me to analyze things. So I was like, you're thinking about how to fix it, right? Well, first we have to deal with all the kinds of agrarian issues that we have and deal with problems in agricultural production. For small holders, for dry farmers, land rights, agricultural extension, in proven agroecological practices like SRI that we heard about before. Reform banking and credit. If people had access to real kinds of loans instead of sort of predatory money lender loans, it would make a big difference. Crop insurance, things like that. And then I thought, oh, so then the other part of it, besides production, of course, is food distribution and access. And that's very much linked to things like gender rights and women's education, to primary education more generally, to access to health care and child care, to clean water, all of which are actually enshrined in the Indian Constitution and have various kinds of policies designed to address them. It's just that they generally are not implemented in any kind of real way. Improved grain storage, maybe shifting the PDS from a kind of big go-down storages, rooms full of grain, to something more like food stamps, where it's a little card. There's new biometric identification cards being issued to every Indian citizen, which should now facilitate that, pulses and edible oils and so on. And then I finally, after I made those lists, don't worry about reading this, I looked at the final section of the Food Security Bill itself, progressive realization of food security. That is, not necessarily in the bill, but goals towards what needs to be done. And in fact, the Food Security Bill has all the things I thought of in order to sort of fix the problem and more, right? So it's not as though there's not awareness of what needs to be done, right? Secure the interests of small and marginal farmers, promote agrarian reform, support women and youth farmers, diversify commodities available under the public distribution system. People are dying because they're eating a little bit of rice. They're not eating millets and lentils and things which are much more nutritious. Access to health care, to drinking water, sanitation, pensions, and so on. So all of the kinds of factors that I thought of are actually right there in the Food Security Bill. So the vision, the imagination of what is possible does exist, right? And I think on the one hand, it's a very hopeful sign. And I have a tendency to feel sort of in despair all the time based on, sort of corruption and inefficiencies. But I think that the imaginary for how to rectify this situation exists. And I close as my last slide. I close because I wanted to, again, think about the issue of real people. When we have a discussion like this, and when we had our food security series in the spring, we tended to talk about 200 million people hungry, big numbers, scary figures, and so on. And you don't know this, of course, but these are people I know. These are people, I took these pictures, they're not from the internet. Here's my team in the field. So you can see me looking a little more scruffy next to the car, and our team from the village with our American students and our Indian students and our workers who are all poor, landless laborers, no access to fields, who live on a daily wage, who buy their slightly rotting grain sometimes in the fair price shop and so on, and who are the ones who actually have to live this future.